I thought I was just offering a quiet place to sit and a warm cup of tea, but the moment my friend's son walked into my kitchen and chose silence over small talk, I felt something shift, like the room itself was holding its breath. What he finally confessed wasn't scandalous, but it was the kind of truth that changes how you see a person forever, and how you see yourself too. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. It was a Tuesday that looked like any other from the outside. Gray sky, the bare branches tapping lightly against my window, the neighborhood moving at its usual pace. I was 49 then, old enough to know better than to assume a day will stay ordinary, and still young enough to be surprised when it doesn't. I'd just finished wiping down the counters when my phone buzzed. It was Melissa, my friend of nearly 20 years. We'd met back when our lives were louder, when we still believed we could plan everything. Now we were women who understood that the best plans were the ones you could bend without breaking. Her message was short. "Ethan's in the area. He's having a rough day. Can he stop by your place for a minute?" I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. Ethan was Melissa's son, and I'd known him since he was all elbows and restless energy, always asking questions, always hungry for attention in that sweet way boys can be. Over the years, I'd seen him at holidays, graduations, quick visits when Melissa would drag him along. I'd watched him grow into a young man with a polite smile and eyes that looked like they were always studying something just beyond the room. Of course, I typed back, "Anytime." 15 minutes later, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was how still he was. Not rude, not cold, just quiet. He stood on my porch as if he'd walked a long distance, even if he hadn't. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his hands tucked into the pockets of a dark jacket that smelled faintly of winter air. "Hi, Ethan," I said gently, stepping aside. "Come in. It's warm." He nodded once and crossed the threshold without a word. I expected him to glance around, to offer a polite line, something like, "Thanks for letting me stop by." But he didn't. He moved into my kitchen the way someone enters a library, carefully, almost afraid to disturb the quiet. I shut the door behind him and watched him for a moment, trying not to hover. The kettle was already on the stove, leftover from my own tea habit. I pointed to the table. "Sit wherever you like," I said. "Do you want tea? Coffee?" He sat, not slumped, not sprawled, just seated upright, hands folded loosely in front of him, like he was waiting for a question on an exam. "Tea is fine," he said, voice low, almost worn out. I poured water into 2 mugs, added a bag to each, and set one in front of him. He wrapped his hands around it, but didn't drink. His gaze stayed on the surface of the tea, as if it might reveal an answer. The silence wasn't uncomfortable at first. It felt respectful, even, like he needed time to settle. I busied myself by wiping a spot that was already clean, then sat across from him. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, loud in the pause. "Your mom said you were having a rough day," I offered softly. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but you're safe here." He swallowed, and for the first time he lifted his eyes to mine. They were older than I remembered. Not in age, he was still young, but in weight, like he'd been carrying something heavy and didn't know where to set it down. "I didn't know where else to go," he said. That simple sentence landed in my chest like a small stone dropped in water, ripples spreading out, because I knew what he meant. Not just that he needed a place, but that he needed a person. Someone outside the storm. I kept my voice steady. "I'm glad you came." He nodded again, and then the silence returned, but this time it had an edge to it, like a held breath. I waited, not because I had a plan, but because I'd learned especially as a woman who's lived through her share of disappointments, that people reveal their truth when they feel you won't brush them. He looked down at his hands. His fingers pressed against the mug so tightly I worried it might be too hot, but he didn't flinch. "I've been doing everything I'm supposed to do," he said finally. I didn't interrupt. I didn't fill the space. I just listened. School, work, helping my mom when she needs it, being the good one. His voice cracked slightly on that last part, and he cleared his throat as if he could fix it by force. But I feel like I'm disappearing inside it. I leaned forward a little. That sounds exhausting. He gave a short, humorless laugh. It is, and if I say it out loud, people act like I'm ungrateful. I nodded slow. Sometimes people confuse gratitude with silence. Like you're only allowed to struggle if your life looks hard from the outside. That made him look up again. This time his eyes held mine longer, and I saw something there. Relief, maybe. Recognition. He took his first sip of tea. His hands trembled just a little. "I keep thinking," he said, "if I stop, even for a second, I'll let everyone down." The words were quiet, but the feeling behind them was huge. I felt it like a draft through a cracked window, cold, persistent, and hard to ignore. I set my palms flat on the table, grounding myself. "Ethan," I said carefully, "you're allowed to be human. You're allowed to be tired, and you're allowed to not have it all figured out." He stared at the tea again, but his jaw tightened. He was fighting something. Tears, anger, fear, maybe all three. Then he went silent once more. Not the polite silence from before. This was deeper, like he'd reached the edge of what he usually allowed himself to say, and the next step would change something. Outside, a car passed on the wet street, tires whispering over pavement. The kitchen clock kept ticking. I waited. And after what felt like a full minute, he inhaled slowly, as if gathering courage from the air itself. "There's something I've never told anyone," he said, barely above a whisper. My heart thudded once, hard. I kept my face calm, my voice gentle. "Okay." He didn't speak right away. He looked at the window, at the dull sky, at the bare branches moving slightly in the wind. Then he turned back to me, and his expression wasn't dramatic, just honest. "I'm scared I'm becoming someone I don't even recognize," he said, "and I don't know how to stop it." My throat tightened, and I felt that familiar pull, the instinct to fix, to solve, to offer advice too quickly. But something told me he didn't need a lecture. He needed an anchor. So I said the simplest thing I could. "Tell me what that feels like." He blinked, as if surprised by the question, as if he expected judgment, and got curiosity instead. His hands loosened around the mug. His shoulders dropped a fraction. And for the first time since he arrived, he looked like he might actually speak from the place he'd been hiding. "I don't know where to start," he admitted. I nodded, voice steady as the ticking clock. "Start with what happened today, the moment you realized you couldn't keep it inside." He stared at me, silent again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that comes right before a truth finally steps into the light. He took a slow breath, the kind that sounds like it's been practiced. I could tell this wasn't the first time he tried to speak these thoughts, only the first time he'd felt close enough to letting them out. "Today was supposed to be simple," he said. "Just another day. I woke up already tired, like I hadn't really slept, even though I did." He paused, rubbing his thumb along the rim of the mug. "Do you ever wake up feeling like you're already behind?" I smiled softly, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. More times than I can count. That seemed to ease him. He leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes drifting to the far corner of the kitchen, where the light didn't quite reach. I went to class, did what I had to do. Everyone kept talking about plans, goals, where they're headed, and I just kept thinking, I don't know if I'm headed anywhere. I'm just moving. The way he said it wasn't dramatic. It was matter of fact, like someone finally admitting they were lost after pretending they knew the way. What made today different? I asked. He hesitated, then nodded once. There was this moment, a small one. A professor asked me a question. Nothing hard. But when I opened my mouth, my mind went completely blank. Not nervous blank, empty blank, like someone turned the lights off inside. He tapped his chest lightly with 2 fingers. That scared me. I listened closely, aware of how quiet the house had become. Even the kettle had stopped its faint humming, leaving only the clock and our voices. I answered eventually, he continued, but afterward I couldn't shake the feeling. Like I wasn't fully there. Like I was watching myself from the outside, doing all the right things, saying all the right words, but not actually feeling any of it. I nodded. That can happen when you've been carrying too much for too long. He looked at me, eyes searching. Is that what this is? Carrying too much. Sometimes, I said, choosing my words with care, we learn to be strong so early that we forget how to put things down. He let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped for weeks. Everyone expects me to be steady. My mom's been through a lot. I don't want to add to it, so I keep telling myself just one more day. Just get through this week. I leaned my elbows on the table. And how long have you been telling yourself that? His mouth twitched, almost a smile. Longer than I want to admit. There it was, the quiet truth. Not a crisis, not a confession that would shock anyone listening. Just a young man admitting he was tired of being okay all the time. I didn't come here to complain, he said quickly, as if afraid of crossing an invisible line. I needed someone who knows my mom, but isn't my mom. I understood that instantly. There are things you can't say to the people you love most, not because they wouldn't listen, but because you don't want to worry them. I'm honored you trusted me, I said. He studied my face, and for a moment I wondered what he saw there. Maybe the years. Maybe the mistakes I'd survived. Maybe the fact that I wasn't trying to fix him. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course. Did you ever feel like you were living the life other people expected, and then one day realized you didn't know where you fit in it? The question caught me off guard, not because it was intrusive, but because it was accurate. I felt a gentle ache rise in my chest, the kind that comes with old memories. Yes, I said honestly. More than once. He waited, giving me the same patience I'd given him. There was a time, I continued, when I did everything right. The responsible choices, the sensible path. And one day I looked around and thought, this life makes sense, but it doesn't feel like mine. What did you do? He asked. I listened, I said, not to the noise, to the quiet voice that kept asking for attention. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. I think that's what scared me today, he admitted. That quiet voice. It's getting louder. That's not a bad thing, I said gently. It just means it's tired of being ignored. He sat with that, eyes drop into his hands again. But this time his shoulders weren't so tense. I didn't know who else would understand, he said. You've lived. You don't rush people. I smiled at that. That comes from learning the hard way. A small silence settled between us again, but it felt different now. Softer, like a pause between thoughts instead of a wall. Outside, the sky darkened slightly, evening creeping in. The room felt warmer, more contained. I'm glad I came, he said quietly. So am I replied. He nodded, then straightened a little in his chair. There's more, he said. Something deeper, but I don't know how to say it yet. I met his eyes, steady and open. "Take your time. We're not going anywhere." He swallowed, then gave a small, grateful smile, the kind that doesn't reach the mouth so much as the eyes. And I knew then that whatever he was about to share next wasn't just about him finding his way. It was about both of us standing at a moment where listening mattered more than anything else. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, resting his forehead lightly against the glass, as if grounding himself in something solid. Outside, the streetlights had come on, casting long reflections on the wet pavement. The world kept moving, unaware of the quiet moment unfolding in my kitchen. "I've always been the one who adapts," he said at last, still facing the window. "If someone needs space, I give it. If someone needs help, I step in. I learned early that being useful made things smoother." I stayed seated, letting him have the space to speak without feeling watched. "That's a skill," I said, "but it can become a burden." He turned around slowly. "That's exactly it. I don't know when helping turned into hiding, but somewhere along the way, I stopped asking myself what I needed." He returned to the table, not sitting yet, just resting his hands on the back of the chair. His voice was steadier now, like he'd crossed an invisible line and realized he could stand on the other side. "Today, after class, I sat in my car for almost an hour," he said. "Didn't start the engine, didn't check my phone. I just sat there." He exhaled. I realized I didn't want to go anywhere. Not home, not forward, not back. That landed quietly but heavily. "I wasn't sad," he added quickly. "That's what confused me. I wasn't angry either. I just felt disconnected. Like I'd been playing a role for so long, I forgot who I was when no one was watching." I folded my hands together, thinking of how many men his age, and older, had likely felt the same thing but never said it out loud, especially the ones raised to believe strength meant silence. "That feeling," I said slowly, "is often the beginning of awareness, not the end of anything." He sat down at last, running a hand through his hair. "I keep thinking I should already know who I am. Everyone acts like there's a schedule for this." I smiled faintly. "If there is, no one gave me a copy." That earned a quiet laugh from him, the first real one since he arrived. "Can I be honest?" he asked. "You've been honest this whole time." He nodded. "I'm afraid that if I stop being who people expect, I'll disappoint them. And if I disappoint them, I don't know who I'll be to them anymore." There it was. Not fear of failure, but fear of losing connection. I leaned back slightly, choosing my words carefully. "Disappointment doesn't always mean rejection. Sometimes it just means change." He considered that. "You really believe that?" "I've lived it," I said. "Some people stayed, some didn't, but the ones who stayed saw me more clearly afterward." He absorbed that in silence, eyes distant but thoughtful. "My mom," he said quietly, "has sacrificed so much. I don't want her to think she raised someone ungrateful." I felt a familiar ache, the instinct to protect both of them. "Gratitude doesn't mean you stop growing," I said, "and it doesn't mean you stop needing support." He looked down, jaw tight. "I don't know how to say that to her." "You don't have to say everything at once," I replied. "Sometimes you just start by saying, 'I'm trying to understand myself.' That's not selfish. That's honest." He nodded slowly. "I wish someone had told me that earlier." I smiled gently. "You're hearing it now. That counts." Another pause followed, but it wasn't heavy. It felt like the quiet after a long walk, when you finally sit down and let your legs rest. "You know," he said, looking up at me, "I almost didn't come here. I thought I'd be wasting your time." I shook my head. "You didn't." "I think," he continued, "I needed someone who wouldn't panic, someone who wouldn't turn this into a problem to fix." I met his gaze. "Some things don't need fixing," They need space. He sat back in his chair, shoulders finally relaxed. This conversation, it doesn't change everything, but it makes things feel possible again. That, I knew, was the quiet victory. Not answers, not resolutions, just possibility. Outside, the rain had stopped. The streetlights reflected more clearly now, steady and calm. He finished his tea, then stood, slipping his jacket back on. At the door, he hesitated, hand on the handle. "Thank you," he said, "for listening, for not telling me what I should be." I smiled. "Any time you need to sit in silence before you speak, you know where to find me." He nodded, then stepped out into the evening, closing the door softly behind him. I stood there for a moment after he left, hand resting on the wood, feeling the quiet settle back into the house. But it wasn't empty anymore. It felt meaningful. I didn't clean up right away after he left. The mugs stayed on the table, the chairs slightly out of place, like evidence that something important had passed through my kitchen. I turned off the light above the sink and stood there in the dim glow from the hallway, listening to the quiet in a different way than before. When you reach a certain age, you learn that not every meaningful moment announces itself. Some arrive quietly, sit with you for an hour, and leave behind a feeling that lingers far longer than the conversation itself. I thought about Ethan driving home, the streetlights passing over his windshield one by one. I hoped he felt lighter, not because his questions were answered, but because he finally let them breathe. I knew that feeling well. The relief of saying, "I don't know," and discovering the world doesn't collapse because of it. Later that evening, Melissa called. Her voice was careful, like she didn't want to ask too much. "He stopped by your place," she said. "He said it helped." I smiled into the phone. "He's a thoughtful young man," I replied. "You raised him well." She was quiet for a moment. "He's been carrying a lot," she admitted. "Yes," I said gently. "And he's learning he doesn't have to carry it alone." After we hung up, I sat in my living room with a blanket around my shoulders, thinking about how many people, especially men, are taught to hold everything inside, to be steady, dependable, silent. I thought about the men in my own life over the years, the ones who never found the words, and the ones who did, sometimes too late. The next morning, sunlight filled the kitchen again, ordinary and reassuring. I washed the mugs, wiped the table, put everything back where it belonged, but something in me had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. A few days later, I received a short message from Ethan. I talked to my mom. It read, "Not everything, just enough." It went better than I expected. I held the phone in both hands, feeling a quiet sense of pride that wasn't mine to claim, but warmed me anyway. All he needed was permission, to feel, to question, to speak. And sometimes permission comes simply from being heard. As for me, that afternoon stayed with me. It reminded me that growth doesn't end at a certain age. That listening is one of the most powerful things we can offer another person. And that silence, when shared with care, can be the doorway to something honest. I still think about that day when the kitchen grows quiet, when the clock ticks a little louder than usual. It reminds me that connection doesn't always come from grand gestures or perfect advice. Sometimes it comes from sitting across from someone, meeting their eyes, and saying, without judgment or fear, "You can speak here." And that, I've learned, can change more than you ever expect.